Hans, thank you very much. Also, Tobias for helping to arrange this, for arranging this. It says I'm being recorded. Got it. Okay. And thank you for also coming. I realize it's close to the Christmas period, and it's tricky, at least in my country, Switzerland, with COVID, and I really am glad that people could make it. This is also special because in the last 2 years, I've given only one other talk where I see people rather than little pictures of people. So I'm a little bit nervous here with actual living, breathing humans, but I think I'll get used to it. Okay, so I'm going to talk about EMV, which is a protocol which you use for payments. All of you are using it. And why for critical protocols, for critical systems, it makes sense to analyze them formally. And I'll tell you a bit about the experience we've had doing this. And you'll see why the title is relevant. Can you rob a bank with a model checker? And the answer is actually, yes, you can. Okay. As is often the case, this work was done by a team of people. And actually, there's two teams. I'll introduce Tamarin, which is our model checker that we developed at ETH within my group. And there are a number of colleagues, and this is just a subset of the Tamarin team, who work with me at ETH, who've been working on this model checker. And this is a project that's been running for 10 years or so. It takes a lot of work to build tools. And for the EMV work itself, this is with Ralph and Jorge. So what is EMV? If you open your wallet, you'll see that you have lots of credit cards, and all of the credit cards follow this EMV standard. So we're talking about Mastercard and Visa, etc. EMV is Europay, Mastercard, and Visa, but it's really a family of credit cards. So you need interoperability because you go to a payment terminal, a point of sale terminal at a store, and you can give them a Visa or a Mastercard or American Express. It could be credit, it could be debit. So there's a standard that regulates what goes on with these payment terminals and your card and the bank. Okay, and that's EMV. So it's a protocol, but it's really a protocol family. There are different modules. And of course, for payments, it's important to have very high security. And you'll see this type of advertisement. And of course, it's easy to make claims. The question is, do these claims hold? Okay, well, what might we want for security? Well, we want something that's also convenient, and EMV does that in that if you do a low-value purchase, so you take a credit card and you go to a payment terminal, you shouldn't have to enter your PIN. So in Switzerland, before COVID, you could do 40 franc purchases without a PIN. And then after COVID, they raised it to 80 because you don't want to touch things, right? But high-value purchases should be protected by a PIN. So, if you have a credit limit of, I don't know, so in Switzerland, it might be 5,000 franc or 10,000 franc. If somebody binds your credit card, or if I steal Matt's credit card, I shouldn't be able to take out 10,000 franc. I should need a PIN for it. That's the whole point of having a PIN, right? To authenticate the user, that's the right user. That's the idea. But it turns out they're not. And I'm going to show you that for both Mastercard and Visa, here's the punchline, your PIN is useless. It serves no purpose. You think it does, but it doesn't, despite the claims of security. And the other punchline is we found that out using a model checker. Okay, so the take-home messages are, well, what did we do? We made a model of this protocol because the vast majority of the protocol you can find available, so it's a standard. It's rather complex, and I'll say a little bit about the formalization of that. And then we found both known and new security issues. So some of the issues we found have been well known for over a decade. I'll talk a little bit about them. But this isn't well known. The PIN for your Visa is useless. That's one result I'll talk about, and then a subsequent result also for your Mastercard. We actually have two separate papers on these, and I'll explain why. That'll become clearer. I'm not, my primary interest in doing research isn't in breaking things. It's how do you create tools to make the world better. So of course, we wanted to make the world better. So we looked into fixes and we went through disclosure processes and things like that. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Maybe in the questions afterwards, when we're not recording, I can say a bit more. But I'll say a little bit about that in the talk. And the experience supports a very general hypothesis, don't trust, verify. And I know that there are many people in the audience who share my belief that this is an important thing to do. Everything I'm describing, you can find, and more, you can find at Embrace, so it looks like Embrace, but Embrace, like hug, at github.io. You'll find videos of attacks, you'll find papers, you'll find lots of details. Okay. So for this work, we use Tamarin. And what is Tamarin? So it's a system we developed in my group. Tamarin is also kind of a monkey. Some people, their systems are acronyms or whatever. We just like the monkey. I mean, look at him. He's likable, right? So Tamarin as a system is a constraint solver. It solves constraints about what a symbolic so-called Doliviau adversary can do based on things that he has seen. And Tamarin is really this constraint solver at its heart disguised as a theorem prover. So it uses this constraint solver to somehow construct proofs about protocols and their correctness. I'm going to give you a crash course. So in like 5 slides in 5 minutes, I'll tell you a little bit about how you might use Tamarin. The underlying algorithmic aspects would be something which would take a longer course than a crash course. Okay, what is Tamarin? Well, it's a model checker, and like many model checkers, you have a system, which is sometimes called the model, because it's a model of the system as opposed to the real physical card. And you have a property. And what we do in Tamarin is it deals with constraints. So we turn both the system and the property into constraints, actually a negation of the property. Then use a constraint solver to find behaviors consistent with the system and the negation of the property. And those would represent an attack on the property P that you could play out on the system. So that's the idea. So Tamarin is a semi-decision procedure. And if it finds a satisfying behavior that satisfies those constraints, that represents an attack, and you can read it off of the system and translate into a message sequence chart and see who does what in a distributed system, and then actually try it out on a real system. In some cases, you end up with an inconsistent constraint system, and that means there is no possible way of attacking the system. That would constitute a proof, and that means no matter how this protocol is run, no matter how many interleaved runs of the protocol you have with an active adversary, there's no way the adversary can defeat the property. The types of systems and properties lead to undecidable problems. So we have a semi-decision procedure, and it works well in practice, but every so often you might run out of time or memory or patience. And then you can go into an interactive mode and actually inspect what Tamarin is doing and construct proofs with it interactively using the constraint solver, or provide hints to the prover that help it work in an automatic mode. So that's the basic idea. So sometimes I say it's a model checker because it has algorithmic verification procedures. Sometimes I say it's a theorem prover because you can think of it as constructing a proof. And for a previous version, you could actually translate those proofs into Isabelle Hall and check them. Not in the current version. Let me say a little bit about how you would use it. You need a specification language to specify what? To specify the model, so the system, the adversary, and the property. So let's look at that. We specify the protocol and the adversary using multiset rewriting rules. A multiset rewriting rule is kind of like a term rewriting rule, but rather than transforming a term, it transforms a multiset, which is a bag of atoms, so a bag of predicates applied to terms. So the general form is you have rules of the form left-hand side is transformed to a right-hand side, and these are labeled rules. They're labeled by a set of actions, which are also special types of facts. So here's an example which might be modeling the state machine of some protocol automata. On the left-hand side, we say, so in would represent input from the network. If the protocol automata gets as input some K, maybe think of that as a key or something like that, and it's in a particular state, so it has a particular thread ID and it's in step 1 of its protocol automata, then you make a transition where you output on the network acknowledge, because I got your key, and you proceed from step 1 to step 2 and you record K in the key K in your state. And this might be labeled with I accept key. I accept the key K. Okay, so this would be a labeled transition that you might specify. So not surprisingly, if you have a set of multi-set rewriting rules, it gives rise to a transition system. So suppose this bag, this is a multi-set of facts. And in this multi-set, we have input of key, and there's a state, thread ID 3, which is in step 1. Then lo and behold, that would match the left-hand side of this rule where K would be instantiated with key and thread ID would be instantiated with key ID 3, etc. And then multi-set rewriting says you take these things out of your multi-set and replace them with instantiated right-hand side, and moreover label the transition. Okay, so you would label the transition this way. So it would be one multi-set transition. And then you could rewrite the resulting state and you would have more multi-set transitions. And that would give you a sequence of state action, of states and actions. And this gives us a trace semantics where for us, when we specify properties, the traces are the sequence of red things, or the sequence of actions labeling the transitions. Those give rise to traces. And in this way, a protocol specifies a set of traces, all traces that are possible via multi-set rewriting. Is there a question?
So the state can go from pair to 3-tuple.
Yeah, sure. Or 5-tuple or whatever. You can add things, subtract things, whatever. Okay, so we have a transition system with a trace semantics. So how do we specify protocols? Well, if you think about protocols in terms of you have different roles, like the initiator role, the responder role, the key server role, for each of those roles, you would specify a protocol automata. And here might be a protocol automata. This is actually for the client state machine of TLS 1.3. And each of these transitions here could be specified via a multi-set rewriting rule. Okay, so here you might have a dozen or whatever multi-set rewriting rules to specify one of the protocol roles. So you do that for all of the roles. Now, we also, security, something is secure only with respect to an adversary. And we have this Dolev-Yao adversary who can see everything on the network and is an active adversary, can inject messages into the network and can analyze things. He can't break crypto, but if he sees a key and something encrypted with it, he can decrypt it. But we might even want to specify special adversaries with additional powers. So for example, we might want to say that some agents or nodes executing roles could be compromised and their session state could be revealed. So in computation models of cryptography, one might talk about things like session state reveal or long-term key reveal relevant for perfect forward secrecy, or randomness reveal, which is where you've compromised a random number generator. So here is state reveal. You might say that if you have a multi-set where there's a state in it where some thread ID has learned some key, then you can output the adversary, well, effectively you just output that key to the network where the adversary gets it. And you label that transition with something bad has happened. There's been a session key reveal of this thread ID where the key has been revealed, okay? And then that goes into your definition of that goes into your set of labeled rewriting rules, multi-set rewriting rules. Okay, now how do you specify properties? So I mentioned that specifications of protocols plus the adversary gives rise to a set of traces. And you specify properties via formulas that refer to particular traces that satisfy the formula. And effectively, you can think of the logic we use is kind of, morally, it's kind of like a pastime first order temporal logic, except rather than using modal operators or temporal operators, we actually explicitly quantify over time points. So it's a two-sorted logic where you can quantify over terms and also time points. So here is how you might say my key is a secret. For all thread IDs, keys, and this sharp means time point I. Think of this, if you have a trace and at some point in the trace, at some point I in the trace, some thread ID has accepted the key K, then it's not the case that there's another time point in the trace, before, after, doesn't matter, where K means knows, the adversary knows or has learned that key at some other time point J. Okay, so this would be what is sometimes called weak secrecy, that something isn't known by the adversary. Okay, so you would interpret that over a trace. So for example, if thread ID accepts this key, then it shouldn't be the case before or after that the key is known by the adversary.
And known here is in the message extraction sense of Dolev.
Yeah, so there's a set of rules for knows. So of course, if it's sent, then you know it. And if it's a pair, then you know the components of it. And if you know components, you know the pair and blah, blah, blah. So it's standard inductive definition, closing up what the adversary knows. Okay, so that's how you would, go ahead.
So the logic only talks about the labels of the transitions, right? Because correct. In your label transition system, you actually ignore the identity of the structures and the states.
So what's in the state is ignored, that's exactly. Right. So it's up to you when you specify the transition system, the labels are really there for specification. And you can talk about things, make things visible that might not even be visible in the state. Like this is where a compromise occurs and whatever, it's up to you. And of course you have to do that carefully. And finally, of course, there's this question of, okay, given this transition system which in general will lead to an infinite state system because you can always start rolls of the protocol and things like that. And the adversary is active and can say infinitely many things. How do you determine if properties are satisfied? And that would be something for another talk. Let me just simply say we use this constraint solving algorithm in backward search, and Tamarin is often successful in doing verification, or if there is an attack and you have enough time and memory and patience, it will find it. Okay. That's, I'll give you references if you'd like to look into that. Okay, let's shift gears entirely and move to EMV. EMV is a beast. I mentioned it's 2,000 pages, 2,000 plus pages. There are 9 submodules. There are lots of variants and options. My goal isn't that you understand EMV in any deep level of detail. I would just like to give you a high level feeling for this protocol. Some high level features, the gestalt, yeah, the form of it. And then we'll talk about what you can do with the model checker and how you can check things in reality, etc. Again, I will be abstracting and simplifying. I don't know if there's any experts here who really work with EMV, but if you do, you'll see that this is I'm doing my best to abstract and simplify. Okay, what's the main idea? At a high level, it's a protocol between different parties. So one party is the card. Let me get a little prop, it helps. So the card, so here's the card. Another is between the terminals. This is the payment terminal that I put the card to. And finally, there is a bank. So for example, if this is a UBS credit card, it would be issued by UBS. And the terminal is at some merchant store. Perhaps I go to an IKEA. And eventually they have to get money from UBS from my bank. Okay? So these are somehow the participants. And the setup of this protocol is such that banks issue cards. So UBS would issue in this case, my ETH Mastercard, okay? Terminals can be produced by anybody. You can become a terminal manufacturer. You can get a terminal from from this person, from that person. And it's not like you have a public key. It's not like they're particularly trusted or you have a public key infrastructure for them or whatever. The real relationship is between the bank and the card. And indeed, then I have to get rid of something that's covering my screen. Okay. And indeed, the bank and the bank, which is responsible for issuing the cards, they share a master key. So this is this MK here, and this is a counter-based protocol. So they share a counter. So they share some state, and one can produce from that a session key. So the idea is that the card and the bank will have a session key, which they can use for secure communication. Here, authenticity is the most important thing for authentic communication. On the other hand, neither the card nor the bank have any a priori relationship with the terminal. So what are we going to do? Well, one way to handle that would be that the terminal can learn things about the card by using a PKI, a public key infrastructure. So one of the complexities of this protocol is that there's different types of keys and key infrastructures used for different things. So we have symmetric key cryptography used between the card and the bank. We have asymmetric cryptography used between the card and the terminal. Users also have pins. These are also ways of doing authentication. There are different things you want to authenticate, that this is a legitimate card, that I am the card holder of this card, not as a card I stole from Mats, for example. And this is going to lead to complexity. And then there's all sorts of options because there's all sorts of different credit cards and all sorts of people wanted to do different things in the game. Okay, so that's the kind of the high level setup and a little bit of intuition why it's complex. So first there's initialization where the card and the terminal agree on very basic things where the card will say, I am a Mastercard, and the terminal will say, we're doing a transaction for 20 Swedish kroner or whatever. And that's the initialization phase. So let's look at this a little bit. What's going on here? Oops. Oh, sorry, I'm having some trouble with my mouse. There we go. Okay, so the protocol starts out where the terminal will say, what kind of a card are you? And the card might be a Visa or an Amex, or there could even be cards that are both Visa and Amex, so that the terminal can be picked between them. Let's see, this we discussed. This is this master key encounter. Then there's going to be an exchange of information where the terminal will say things like you're in Sweden, where we have Swedish kroner, and the terminal also has a nonce, so we have nonces for freshness. And then the card will talk about, there's a whole bunch of TLAs, 3-letter acronyms here, and 4-letter acronyms. We'll send some application identifiers. So these are these, oh no, right. So the AID is the application identity where it says what kind of a card it is. And then right, so this is, there's data object lists where the terminal and the card have to communicate information. So the terminal will say to the card, this is what I mentioned, that you're in Sweden, etc. So that's what's going on in this option here. And then over here, the card will talk about what types of authentication methods it supports. And we'll see there's 2 types of authentication. One is somehow knowing that this is a legitimate card, and also authenticating data with a transaction. And the second thing is that I'm the person who should have this card. Okay, and then in this initialization phase, there's also various data sent, and there's a PKI that's set up. So when we think about PKIs, we think about the web PKI. You know, this is what we're using when we surf with CAs like VeriSign. But probably the most successful PKI is the banking PKI, because there are these 10 billion banking cards out there. And they're all associated with asymmetric key pairs. And there's a banking PKI infrastructure for it. So let's see, how does that work? So there's a banking CA who issues a certification, establishes a binding between the bank B and the bank's public key. And then there's a certificate that's signed by the private key of the CA, and let's assume that everybody is set up with that. Then there's a certificate signed by the private key of B, and you can find out what the public key is to check the signature using this certificate, that binds C, the card, to a public key, plus some additional parameters, okay? And this is information that you can actually store statically on the card. So in this stage here, we have the card sending to the terminal its PAN, which is the primary account number. That's the number you would read off of here. An expiry date. So this is good until 4/22, and then these various certificates and appropriate and some additional data. Okay, so this is the initialization. So at this point, the card and the terminal know who each other is, and some certificates were sent such that the terminal can check things that have been signed, because signatures will be used to authenticate information from the card to the terminal, whereas MACs using the shared secret between the card and the bank. Okay, now there are 2 types of authentication. One is called data authentication. So this is a valid card, and things like the payment amount is the proper payment amount, and the other is cardholder authentication. So here for data authentication, again, the road forks and there are different variants. There's, for example, static data authentication, where the only thing which is authenticated, and this can be stored on the card, keep in mind these certificates have been sent. So the card signs with the public key of the bank, the cardholder number, and the expiration date, and certain static information. So this is the weakest form of authentication. There are some cards from the past that only supported that. But in general, one uses dynamic data authentication, or even combined dynamic data authentication, where the transaction amount and the purchase amount and nonces are also authenticated. So here I pointed to some of that going on. So here, the nonces from the terminal and from the card are both signed by the card using its private signing key, which can be checked by the terminal using these certificates here. And later on, some information about the payment and the like, transaction, purchase amount, etc., will also be signed and sent to the terminal. So this is offline data authentication using a CDA. So the point of these steps is, at the end of the day, we know this is a valid credit card, and we know that I'm in Sweden and I just purchased something for 20 or 200 krona or whatever. Okay. Then afterwards is cardholder verification. This is to check that this is my credit card, as opposed to I stole one from Mads, or I found his wallet on the street and I'm trying to use it for a high value transaction. And there are 5 types. So one of them is non-digital. You still find this in the US, where you sign things. And one just assumes that you can recognize signatures that I can't sign for Mads, that the person at the shop will know that that's not Mads' signature, it's mine. That's the assumption for the security of it. Not super secure. So these days we typically use digital methods. The digital methods are fourfold. The first is plain text PIN, where the terminal sends the PIN in plain text to the card. So you can imagine maybe it's connected galvanically, so in the card reader, or maybe it's NFC. And the card checks and says yes or no. Hint or test, think about why this may not be a great protocol. The card just says yes or no. But you might think, well, what if an attacker can do a man in the middle and change a no to a yes? We're going to see later on that Tamarin finds these attacks, but these were known for over a decade. So plain text PIN is kind of bad, but still it's supported in some places and some people use it. Then there's offline enciphered PIN, which is basically the terminal encrypts the PIN, and there's some additional randomness and things like that, and sends it to the card. And then the card can decrypt it and check it and then says yes or no. Test, why is that a bad protocol? Answer, it's bad for the previous reason. The attacker can change a no to a yes. So we're going to see these have some weaknesses, but those are known. That's nothing new. Then there's online PIN. Online PIN is kind of interesting. The card isn't actually used. You enter your PIN on the terminal. You type your PIN into the terminal. The terminal, it's online, so it sends it to the bank, and the bank checks. That's a bit better. This man-in-the-middle attack doesn't work, but you have to be online. Most transactions are online, but again, there are many options. These cards are set up such that if you're, I don't know, in the bush somewhere in some remote place, you can buy things with your credit card, and maybe they don't have a 4G, 5G connection, but later on they can go online and upload the purchases. Finally, there's CVM, and this is the most exciting thing. This is what I always do. You click. You click your phone and you see all of these credit cards on it, and you go zack with your phone to the payment terminal. You don't have to touch things. You don't even have to touch the payment terminal. This is super convenient. And there, the idea, what's the idea? What I also like about it is I don't have to type in pins. And you don't type in pins because this is authenticating me. It sees my face, and that's the authentication. And the terminal and the bank accept that the authentication is happening on this. It's kind of a pain with masks because then I do have to enter a PIN, but I'm doing it on my phone, so I get my terms. I'm sure many of you are using that, and we're going to see that that leads to some issues. Okay, finally, there's a transaction authentication, which is where the bank says, all good or all bad. And here, again, there's this issue that the data and this is a horribly confusing diagram because I have this line for different options, but maybe here's a take-home message. On one, I don't want to go through all these different fields. It's painful. On one hand, we have cryptograms, like AC is an authentication cryptogram. That's a MAC using the shared key between the card and the bank. So the bank shares the view of the card with what's going on. On the other hand, we have things which are being signed, like this static SDAD, this authentication data that's being signed by the private key of the car. And that's going to the terminal because the terminal doesn't have this shared key and it has to check signatures. And there's also the case there are different options. For example, if things are going, if we have this online PIN verification, so there's different parties getting different information authenticated. And of course, a central question at the end of the day is, do they all have the same views of what's going on? And this is what we want when we start thinking about properties. All have the same view of what's going on, of the data involved, if the terminal rejects, the bank should reject, and things like that. So we'll look later on if that's the case. There's some additional steps here that aren't so important for this talk, where the card authenticates the bank and updates its state. So for example, if you type a PIN 3 times wrong, your card gets locked. And that's also relevant, but that won't be so relevant for the attacks I'm talking about. Okay, so at the end of the day, either the transaction is declined offline, accepted online, accepted offline, which is typically a low value. So the reader needn't be connected to the bank, but the card actually has a threshold on how high the purchases can be, or authorized online. Okay, that was actually a lot that I said. I wanted to give you a high-level abstract view, but probably I spent like 10 minutes on it. Don't worry, there's not going to be a test. I don't expect you to remember all the details. But the main thing that there's 2 types of authentication going on, lots of options, 2 different types of keying infrastructure, and this leads to some complexity. I guess that's the point. This is a complex protocol. Okay, so what are the main properties considered? They're pretty intuitive. The first is that if the bank says, yeah, this is a good transaction, excuse me, if the terminal says, how do I want to say this? I can say it from the standpoint of the bank or the terminal. If the terminal is going to accept a transaction, the bank will not decline the transaction, okay? So the bank will accept, said another way, the bank will accept transactions accepted by the terminal. Okay, how might we specify this? We might say for all transactions in all points I, if the terminal accepts a transaction at the time point I, then it's not the case that at some point the bank declined the transaction. Now, what we often do is we consider the case of different types of compromise. And if some honest party is compromised, if a bank is compromised, or if a card were compromised or whatever, then we don't get any guarantees. So we say, so it's not the case that the bank declines, or there was some party who was presumed honest who was actually compromised. So different rules would label different types of compromise in their transactions. That relates to the question that you asked. And if a party like a bank were compromised, then all bets are off. Okay, so what shouldn't happen is that you have a trace where the bank declined some transaction, but the terminal accepted the transaction. Okay, that's the first property we would like. The second property we would like is that transactions are authenticated to the terminal. So the terminal's view of transactions, the information involved in the transactions, should be the same as the parties interacting with the terminal. They authenticate themselves to the terminal. Now, the word authentication can mean many different things. And here we mean not only does the terminal know with whom it's talking about, but there's agreement on data. So for those of you who work with security protocols, Gavin Loa in the 90s actually showed there are many different notions of authentication, like a party is alive, or a party is alive in the right role, or your view of the data agrees with them, or even so-called injective agreement, where each run that I do corresponds to a unique run that you do, which might prevent which would prevent replay attacks. So here we have a kind of injective agreement, and let's look at how it's specified. It says whenever. So we would have transitions that talk about I commit. I'm the terminal, I'm in the terminal role, and I commit to a transaction with certain data. Then what do I want? That's what we're saying here. Then somebody else was running the protocol with me in either the card or the bank role, in this case here. So they were running in the right role, and we agree on the same data. So I, the terminal, my view agrees. If I have this view, then the other parties were running the protocol and their views agree. And moreover, we have here for this injective agreement, it's not the case that there are other parties running the protocol who agree with me. So it's not like we have replay attacks going on. Or somebody honest has been compromised. Okay, so just to sum up, the view of the terminal agrees with the view of other parties. And finally, we can have that the view of the bank agrees with the view of other parties. So at the end of the day, we want that the terminal and the bank have the right view of what's going on with each other and also with the card. And that's what these two properties are saying. Okay, so now we're in a situation where we have I mentioned there's a protocol, and then there's a specification of it in Tamarin via multi-set rewrite rules. We have properties, and we can now ask ourselves, does this protocol have these properties? So to help understand the results, in this slide, we break it down into different cases here. We consider whether it's contact or contactless. So contact is where you put your card in a slot in the terminal in the reader, and contactless is where you wave it above it, okay? So that's this first thing. So this is a contact case. And then these are the ways that you do the SDA, DDA, and CDA, the authentication of whether this is a valid card and basic values like transaction amounts. And then plain PIN, online PIN, etc. This is how I check that it's my credit card, not Mads' credit card, by giving the right PIN. And then there's the online and the offline case. So again, there's a lot of complexity here because there's different cases, and this is to help you depict them. Okay, so the first observation is that only transactions using CDA, where all of the transaction data and the nonces are authenticated, are actually really secure. And moreover, you need online PIN. And we talked about the problems with offline PIN, and we'll come back to them, or no PIN, assuming that people can recognize my signature, assuming that those are secure. On the other hand, if you use plain text PIN or offline and cipher PIN, these admit this PIN bypass attack where a yes is turned into a no. And that's cold coffee, as we say in German, kalte Kaffee. That's known since over a decade. by, for example, Murdoch et al. From Cambridge. Also, transactions where not all of the data is authenticated, perhaps not so surprisingly. They admit attacks where the terminal accepts them and the bank declines them. And I should say above here, I have the different properties. This first property is we also specify that the whole protocol can be run to an end. That's executable. And here, recall this is bank accepts. So this is talking about the relationship between the bank's acceptance and the terminal's acceptance. And this is saying that the terminal has a view that agrees with all of its parties, and this other parties in the bank has the right view that agrees with all of the other parties. Just to remind you what those properties are. So X means violated, green means check means it's good. So we're seeing lots of things violated. And these violated things can lead to attacks and have led to attacks. So if you use these weaker authentication methods, there's an attack where the terminal accepts them, but the bank declines them. This is bad. It means I go to the IKEA and the terminal says yes, so I take all the goods out of the IKEA, and then later on the bank says no, but I'm gone with the goods. And there were some other issues that we found related to secrecy, but that would be for another time. They're not so interesting. But the interesting point here is weaponizing these is difficult because we are in the online case. So here's online. Put the card into the reader, and if you have to man in the middle of that, you have to build some little slotty device that you stick in the terminal, and then the card somehow slips into it, and hopefully the person you're doing the payments with won't notice, or somehow that has to be done in a discrete way. But it's possible to do these in an attack setup, and here's the attack setup of the Cambridge researchers, Murdoch et al. But it's not really weaponizable in practice. So these are attacks that are permitted by the model. These are attacks that exist in reality, but the credit card companies do not lose much sleep about this, okay? I would say they should actually fix these attacks, but they don't lose much sleep because they haven't been losing much money.
Can one just build a device like that?
Say it again?
Can one just build a device like a fake POS?
Well, the POS has to be associated with a vendor.
Okay, so
actually,
there is a check.
For doing the attacks that we did, we actually registered ourselves as a vendor by SumUp, and we got a SumUp point of sale terminal, and we could do attacks, and the attacks were completely realistic because we were a vendor and we attacked ourselves. Then we would attack others for small amounts using or for large amounts using our own credit cards. And if you just buy a POS, I mean, I guess you could defraud yourself, but that's not so interesting. More interesting are the contactless protocols, and that's interesting because a man in the middle could potentially be much easier. And also there are interesting possibilities where this is the attacker. Okay, and we found that in our original model, and I'll say more about this, most common Mastercard transactions were secure. So there are different kernels, different subprotocols for Mastercard and Visa, and we had to model them. But surprisingly, most common Visa transactions are not secure. So we found problems where the view of the terminal and the view of the bank would be different. They'd either differ from each other or differ from the card. And let me go into that because that's actually quite interesting. So what is the problem? The problem with Visa contactless. So this is what Tamarin told us. So there's two types of verification. This is a legitimate card, and this is a legitimate card holder. This is my card. And for the card holder verification, the choice of the method, we call there were 5, was stored in something called the card transaction quantifier. And you see that here, the CTQ in various fields. So if you can change the CTQ, you can change how the card holder is apparently verified from one method to another. Now, can you change that? Well, the CTQ is authenticated by signed dynamic authentication data. Okay, so maybe you can't change it. But most Visa transactions, the different modules do things differently, and there's all these different options. And this is what model checkers are good at finding. So most Visa transactions, there are paths, there are executions, don't use the SDAD. And therefore, the CTQ can be changed, and therefore the CVM can be modified. Let's look at how that works. So we built, when we found this attack, we built a little demonstration of it that uses 2 cellular phones, 2 mobile phones, and the mobile phones speak with the point of sale terminals over NFC. So when I hold my card over a terminal, it's using NFC, near field communication for communication. The same when I hold my phone, I use Apple Pay, Google Pay, whatever, that's NFC. Okay, and the two phones used for the attack will communicate with each other over Wi-Fi. Okay, and this will pretend it's a card to the terminal, and this will pretend it's a point of sale terminal. So it'll pretend it's one of these to the card. Okay, so how is this going to work? So terminal will send a command saying we require cardholder verification. So the command goes through, and the card will respond saying, "Oh, this is a huge amount. Somebody's trying to take 10,000 franc or 10,000 kroner, whatever, out of franc is more, out of Maud's account. So we need an online PIN." And then this phone here will change this data to indicate that online PIN is not required and that verification was performed on the device. And that's forwarded here. So the point of sale terminal thinks that this is like an Apple Pay payment, and the verification has gone on via my cell phone. Maybe it used my face or my fingerprint to check that I'm really me, and it's allowed to use a credit card. Wow, so let's look at how that works. So I'm going to show you a little video. There's actually 3 phones here. So this is a sum up terminal. This is one we did ourselves. We registered ourselves as a vendor, but this will work in any store. You go to your Migros, Co-op, whatever in Switzerland we have, and it'll work. And these don't have a SIM card built in, so this is just used to communicate with the merchant bank, okay? And these are going to be the 2 phones used for the man-in-the-middle attack. This will communicate with the card. NFC, this will communicate here, and we're going to do a high-value purchase. I think it was 400 franc, if I remember correctly. Okay, so here we go. So we enter the amount, 200 franc. 200 franc. Okay, so this says yes. And this is please enter your credit card. This is into your credit card. NFC here. This is going to go here wireless. Data is going to be changed here. This is bitte warten, so please wait. This succeeds. Zahlung. What's it say in German? Zahlung.
Verweigert?
I can't even read. Genehmigt. Okay, so it's approved. So what's the point? The point is that was a high value purchase. It was approved. The PIN was never entered. If I find Maud's credit card, I can do that. I can make high value purchases without the PIN. This is so here we have a model. We find an attack on the model, and the attack can be weaponized and used in the real world. Namely, I have his card. I put it in my pocket with the phone. I go into the IKEA. I make my high value purchase with this. This is what everybody's doing these days. That's perfectly good attack. They'll never catch it. Never catch it. So this is kind of exciting. You know, in the past, when I did my PhD and my postdoc in Edinburgh, et cetera, I thought about safety because I think we need to make the world a safer place. You know, nuclear reactors shouldn't explode, and X-ray machines shouldn't hit us with too much energy. And people care about that, but they really care about security. So if you want to get a lot of press, don't stop nuclear reactors from exploding. Find attacks on credit cards. I have never had so much press for anything in my life. If you Google EMV bypass attack and pick a language, you can pick Swedish. Probably you will find dozens of articles in Swedish. You can write it in Portuguese, write it in Chinese. I think at the end of the day, we stopped counting at over 1,000 articles. So here are a couple PIN bypass flaws, academic bypass PIN, Sicherheitslücke bei Visa Kreditkarten entdeckt, Zahlen ohne PIN. You'll find this in every language. That really created a roar. That was kind of exciting. But of course, our point is how to use these tools to make things better. So we looked at countermeasures to the PIN bypass. And the problem was that the Visa cards don't use the signed dynamic authentication data, which is what's used to protect the CTQ, right? So there's an easy fix to always have cards supply this and to have, so here we have the signed data, and to have the terminal verify it. So a couple branches of the protocol have to be modified such that that's the case. So there's technical detail on how you would do it. But what's interesting is this fix is relatively easy to deploy. There's 10 billion credit cards out there, but you can deploy this on the terminals without reissuing the cards. So the terminals typically allow firmware upgrades, so you could upgrade the terminals. This would be a possible fix. This was one fix that we proposed, and we also then fully verified it using Tamarin. We found a number of other issues which were interesting. Some had to do with low-value offline transactions on Visa or Mastercards not being secure. And this had to do with the fact that in the offline case, you're communicating data to the terminal that is signed, and slightly different data will be communicated to the bank later on when the thing goes online. And the data communicated to the terminal could be modified in such a way that the terminal could accept a transaction that the bank rejects. So at the end of the day, my credit card won't be charged for things, but somebody with my credit card could go into the IKEA and get goods and walk out. And at the end of the day, IKEA would be defrauded. They've given goods away, but they don't get compensation. We found attacks on that, and the attacks are new. We did not test them in the wild for ethical reasons. So the previous attacks, we attacked it on being our own merchant or using our own credit cards. We would only defraud ourselves. But here we would end up defrauding merchants. So we didn't test these attacks, but I'm pretty sure that they work. They'd be super easy to test. Unfortunately, they're actually rather difficult to fix. You have to do some additional authentication, which can only be done by changing part of the protocol that runs on the cards. And this would require reissuing all cards. So to my knowledge, these attacks still exist today on Visa cards, and they are difficult to fix. But then the world got really weird. So after this initial work, I was talking with Jorge and with Ralph about this, and we were saying, okay, we found attacks in our model, and these attacks are real, but our model also contains some abstractions. What if we go in and we bore down and we sorry, that's German, and we drill down and we look in detail at some of these abstractions, and maybe we'll find more. And it turned out that one abstraction that we had made is this notion of communication between so the terminal is associated with an acquirer. So this is, this might be IKEA's terminal, and they got this via some company like SumUp or whatever, and they have their own banks, and then there's a payment network with the card issuer's bank, and maybe I have a UBS credit card. And there are different payment networks for Mastercard and Visa and things like that. So abstractly, it's just a network, but there are different payment networks. And it turns out if you bring those payment networks into the model, then suddenly wild and crazy things that at least I lacked the imagination to think of, but Tamarin doesn't need imagination, just finds everything that a model checker can find. One is if you replace the card's AID, these are the application identifiers, which say I am a Visa or I am a Mastercard. So if you take a Mastercard, here's a Mastercard. So we didn't find attacks on Mastercard, but you use it for payment. And the man in the middle says this is a Visa card, and that can be done by changing this AID. Then it can deceive the terminal to activating the Visa kernel and using the Visa payment network. And then the previous attack that I just showed you on Visa can be used to attack a Mastercard. It actually works. You can actually do it, boom. And you can find videos where that's done on our webpage. And that also created a whole bunch of press, but I'll spare you. I'll spare you the details on that. The good news is, maybe I can say a bit more offline, is that some members of EMV took this stuff very, very, very seriously, and we're working with one of them on the verification of a redesign that should address all these issues. So let me draw conclusions. It's about right, and then we'll have some time for questions. So a point I want to make is that formal methods matter. I realize many cases here, preaching to the converted, the top formal methods people, but still not everybody somehow sees it that way. And one way to show it is to show it matters for things that people really care about, and people really care about money. So yes, you can rob the bank with a theorem prover. And I think a good point is that tools are sufficiently advanced that they can and should be used. This should be standard. This isn't esoteric stuff that academics with white hair and beards can carry out. Everybody can carry out. Engineers can carry out. They should be carrying it out. So first of all, it forces good hygiene. You have to be explicit about your protocol, about your adversary, and your properties. You should be doing this even if you don't use these tools, right? Secondly, you can find errors or produce proofs, and that's very useful. That gives you assurance. And moreover, it's possible to follow standardization errors. You can check, once you build a basis model of a system, whether it's TLS 1.3, which went through numerous revisions, or EMV, makes it very easy to update and keep it current over time, and help with assurance. So, of course, I'm not saying we have a silver bullet for everything. There are research challenges, in particular complexity. The problems are undecidable. We have abstractions of cryptography. We're trying to make those abstractions less coarse. Bring in, in Tamarin, you can bring in equational properties of cryptographic operators that adversaries might exploit, which is quite useful. The ability to model very fine-grained adversary capabilities, that's important. So handling complexity, improving the scope and accuracy of our tools. And finally, and I think this is a big limiting factor, is education. We need to get the message out. We need to train engineers. So right now I'm on my sabbatical, and one of the things I'm doing is I'm writing a book on Tamarin, where we're talking about these types of success stories and trying to show that, with a reasonable education in engineering, computer science, math, these tools are usable. They're within grasp of the working engineer, and you can really use them to solve problems that matter. So with that, I'll draw conclusions. With that, I'll close up. There are 2 papers based on this work. This work on the original PIN bypass attack on Mastercard was at Oakland this year. To my amazement, I find it kind of funny. So I think of myself as fairly, my roots are in theory, but this won the best practical paper award. So that's a nice recognition that formal methods can be practical. And the card brand mix-up attack, where you can use the Visa payment network for Mastercard, that was in this year's Usenet Security. And here's some other papers on relevant background. Thank you very much.